because I come from a background with, it started getting the conversation going about how Dungeons and Dragons formed our early education, our ways of thinking, and it kind of linked into different methods for different types of educational personalities like kinesthetic or learning, or there's various visual kinesthetic. You learn by doing, learn by dancing. I'm in education for a little bit, and so it kind of tied into that, and that kind of tied into how people play Dungeons and Dragons. And some people play it in a very abstract sense, and some people play in a very visual sense, or an oral sense, or a textual sense, or a mathematical sense. And so I always kind of talk to them about the fact that I play it from a very visual sense. And so I kind of credit Dungeons and Dragons to a lot of my ability to formulate conceptualization of spaces and conceptualization of color, shape, form to the early exercises I did as a preteen, teen, adolescent, on into college, thinking about great spaces that I would have in my dungeons if I was to construct it. So I kind of gave to the point where my own work, which I'll show in a little bit, kind of has a lot to do with organization of space and how it's just kind of the same thing as Minds and More, just on acid inside the shopping mall with stuff going on. So the images I brought in were kind of related more to things that I could through the history of me studying art history and stuff, just stuff I could track. So oh, this totally looks like the illustrations I grew up with. I grew up doing the second edition type of period, so not so much where they had the really nice funky black and white line illustrations of some of the earlier artists like Jim Holloway's right on the cusp, and then there was Larry Elmore and Jeff Easley who were the big guys in the and a couple other ones in the Dungeons and Dragons manuals that you'd see, and it's a very fine art, and it's kind of interesting going through your studies. It's oh, that's totally where they got this sensibility, or this use of color, or this use of subject matter and whatnot. Pretty much related to Casey's own experience with where he got from point A to point B. So I brought in a couple images related to this. This is Lawrence Alma Tadema, I think. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing it correctly. He's a Victorian artist, English Victorian artist. And the first thing I did when I saw a picture of this, it looks totally like Dinotopia, if you've ever seen that book. But it's the exact same sense of colors, the exact same sense of wandering space. It's just pretty much the fantasy around the fantasy pictorialized, romanticized version in the Victorian sense of ancient Rome or Egypt or all these classical things. And it's kind of the start of the whole Art Nouveau, romantic evolution that would kind of go into formulate Tolkien's childhood, and they'd go on and him and C.S. Lewis would write those things. So it's kind of it's all kind of interrelated about how all these types of art histories kind of starts, as you grow up, starts piling up and starts formulating a wider sense of history around the same cheesy crap your old D20s about for with your kids in the basement. So these are a couple of examples, and it's the stuff I really like about these is the grand sense of space, the perfection of perspective, and how you can kind of arrange the colors, and how everyone's really quite happy in white, and in this picture. I meant that totally sarcastically, if you couldn't tell. So. But this is again the Victorian sense. And so I also brought in Henry Darger, which is different because Henry Darger is if you don't know who Henry Darger is, an outsider artist, is kind of a crazy guy that had pretty much a total recluse and worked as a custodian for a church's orphanage or a church's refectory or something. But he created this giant book or grand work revolving around the Vivian Girls, which was his invention of this grand tale. And he also provided illustrations for them, and a lot of the illustrations were tracings of advertisings and child storybooks, and he'd make these huge grand stories. So the book would stretch for thousands upon thousands of pages, and then with accompanying illustrations would show these really simplified watercolors. So I brought him in as kind of another example of some of the things that we brought the ability of taking fantasy worlds, Dungeons and Dragons, into our own art practice, kind of the permissibility of what's accepted as kind of an art practice. The sense of fantasy, sense of nostalgia, sense of idealization without rationalization can kind of be brought forward as a viable type of communication. So I just brought a couple of these examples here. And like half the illustrations for the Movie Girls depicts like total horror war, with the horror war with like little girls getting shot and hung and crucified and stuff, with all these various people with like military uniforms on. And then the other half is like these magic creatures and like a lot of Christian symbology involved with this. And this is Alex Di Maria, who, this illustration is in the curated show,
The Cursed Chateau.
The Cursed Chateau, that Tim put together. You want to talk about it?
I just gotta say, this isn't an illustration.
It's a cut paper.
Cut paper.
Yes.
The white space is negative space. It blew my mind when I actually saw it in person. I didn't believe him when he explained it to me. When he was just given the image for the book, I had ignored them. But okay, sorry.
But this is so this is involved with Tim, and so when Tavis said, "Oh, you totally should see this like illustrated book, The Cursed Chateau," it's like I want that because it was like illustration after illustration of like really like, I'm not going to say clever, but really well executed like cross like cultural versions of like illustrations for a fantasy adventure module. There's a couple other illustrations. These are like insanely detailed as well. So, alphabetically skipping over to Haggerty, which is my last name. Like I said, I don't know if I said this before, but I kind of keep my Dungeons and Dragons and my fine arts separate from a certain time. At certain points, I came into art school the first like year and a half into illustration. It was going to be comics and games illustrations, and I'm pretty sure that's like at least a whole quarter of all male like art school graduates go in at that certain job set, and then like I'm sure a lot of them changed like I did. So I went in for illustration, not so I gradually drifted and like started to keep things separate. And at first it was like difficult, like, you know, I have a lot of love towards like, you know, this activity, this like escapist activity that's like really fun, it's very intimate, you have it with your friends or people you associate, you do it live. And so it's pretty much having a creative show for a very select, very few audience that you trust implicitly for most of the time. Conventions change all that, but like it's a type of very intimate, like performative, visual, like oral narrative type of sense that you have with people. So for the first bit, like when I was in school, I was having trouble keeping the rectifying the fact that I didn't want to make artwork about that, but I thought it was really cool at the same time. So I had a hard time like justifying what I was doing that was away from what I loved and then what I needed to do work. But gradually, very recently, after many years, like, you know, playing regularly, it's like more of a pleasure to keep them separate because one supplies me more with like an innocent release, because literally what I'm doing at the table is making like entertaining things just for the people that are witnessing it at the table. So this is an example, just to get to the point, this is an example of a battle map, a battle grid, which you move miniatures around for positioning yourself. And so this is like a brush and ink and gouache and like colored pencil battle map that I make for an as of yet unrun adventure that I made. And so it's like, you know, it's really crazy like having access to artist materials and making like game-related like paraphernalia, because it's like you show up at the table and everyone else who doesn't like lift a finger or a brush. It's like, how'd you do that? It's like, that's great. And it's like the same type of like adolescent like joy you get from showing your friends like a really cool drawing. It's the same thing that happens at the table. So it's like it's the same type of expression. Like you feel good about the communication that you're doing, like in the fine art sense, like in a gallery or a large communication. But then you still get this nostalgic type of like joy from showing the people immediately at the table. So that's a battle map. This is another like, you know, painted battle map that I have like for grids and whatnot.